Coca-Cola used to have actual cocaine in it. The Wild West had stricter gun laws than your city does right now. And America, land of the free, ran its own program to forcibly sterilize 60,000 people, then handed the blueprint straight to the Nazis. Every single thing you just heard is true. And your school taught you the exact opposite. For 13 years, they fed you a version of American history that was carefully edited, conveniently cleaned up, and in 111 specific places. Flat out wrong. Today, we're cracking open all of it. No spin, no textbook, and definitely no apology. Smash that subscribe button right now because your friends are walking around quoting fake history with total confidence. 1. Imagine inventing breakfast just so people would stop being horny. That was the entire mission of Sylvester Graham and John Harvey Kellogg, two health nuts who genuinely believed bland food would kill your urges. Graham gave America the cracker. Kellogg gave America cornflakes. Both men were convinced that anything tasty turned you into a sinner. So they served the blandest food possible, hoping the nation would calm down. America took the snacks and completely ignored the sermon. 2. Everybody pictures the Wild West as a place where everyone blasted away in the streets. Reality was hilariously boring. Towns like Tombstone had strict gun control, and the moment you rode in, the sheriff made you hand over your weapons like a kid surrendering a slingshot. Cowboys grumbled. Lawmen insisted. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral actually kicked off because some cowboys refused to disarm. So the real Wild West was mostly people arguing about where to park their guns. 3. America once ran its own eugenics program. And yes, it was as horrifying as it sounds. The government forcibly sterilized over 60,000 people it decided were unfit, including the poor and disabled. Officials acted like they were tidying up the gene pool. Families were devastated. Judges shrugged. The truly chilling part is that Nazi Germany studied these American laws and used them as a blueprint. So, while textbooks skip it, America accidentally handed dictators a how-to guide for cruelty. 4. Picture grabbing a refreshing Coca-Cola in the 1890s and getting an actual buzz. The original recipe really did contain cocaine, pulled straight from coca leaves. Customers felt wonderful and had no idea why. Pharmacists smiled. Buyers came back constantly, somehow always thirsty. The company quietly removed the cocaine around 1903 once people started raising eyebrows. So that legendary feeling of an old-timey Coke being magically refreshing was not your imagination. It was chemistry doing some very illegal heavy lifting. 5. President James Garfield got shot in 1881, and honestly, the bullet was the nicest part of his day. The wound itself was survivable. His doctors, however, decided to dig around inside him using their bare, unwashed fingers. Infection set in fast. The doctors looked confused. Garfield slowly suffered for 80 agonizing days while these geniuses kept poking. He finally died not from the assassin, but from the medical care. So technically, America lost a president to a group of men who refused to wash their hands. 6. Everybody knows the stiff straight-arm salute as something deeply sinister, but Americans used to do it proudly. The original Pledge of Allegiance came with a rigid extended arm gesture called the Bellamy salute. School kids did it every morning without a second thought. Teachers led it, parents approved. Then the 1940s arrived, and a certain European dictator started doing the exact same move. America looked around, realized the optics were a disaster, and switched to the hand over heart in 1942. 7. The Pilgrims landed expecting confused strangers, and instead met a native man who greeted them in fluent English. His name was Squanto, and his backstory was brutal. He had already been kidnapped and dragged to Europe as a slave, where he picked up the language. He eventually made it home. The Pilgrims were stunned. Squanto basically became their translator and survival coach. So the heartwarming first Thanksgiving was powered by a man whose English skills came from surviving a kidnapping. 8. The American Civil War kicked off with a massive dramatic bombardment, and the body count was a grand total of 0. Confederate forces shelled Fort Sumter for roughly 34 hours straight. Cannons roared. Smoke filled the sky. Both sides braced for carnage. Yet somehow not a single soldier died in the fighting itself. The only death came afterward during a surrender ceremony when a cannon misfired. So the bloodiest war in American history opened with the world's least deadly fireworks show. 9. A man calmly boarded a plane in 1971, ordered a drink, then announced he had a bomb. He called himself D.B. Cooper. He demanded $200,000 and several parachutes. The airline handed everything over. Passengers were released. Then, somewhere over the Pacific Northwest, Cooper opened the rear stairs and jumped into the freezing night sky. Investigators searched for decades. He vanished completely. To this day, nobody knows who he was or whether he even survived the leap. 10. Americans light fireworks every July 4th to celebrate a date that is technically wrong. Congress actually voted for independence on July 2nd, and John Adams was so sure that date would be the big one that he basically called it. He was off by 2 days. The famous document was finalized on the 4th. Most signers did not even put pen to paper until August, so the entire country throws its biggest birthday party on a day that is essentially a clerical mix-up. 11. Everybody says Nixon got impeached, and everybody is wrong. The man saw the cliff coming and jumped first. As the Watergate scandal closed in, the House was gearing up to impeach him, and the votes were clearly there. Nixon read the room. Lawmakers sharpened their pens. So in 1974, he simply resigned on live television before they could officially do it. He dodged the impeachment label by quitting, which is basically rage quitting the presidency to avoid getting kicked from the game. 12. The Pony Express sounds like it shaped the whole frontier, yet it barely lasted longer than a gym membership. The whole operation ran for only about 18 months. Brave riders galloped across dangerous terrain delivering mail at breakneck speed. People were impressed, investors were hopeful. Then the telegraph wires went up, letting messages zip across the country instantly, and the entire horse-based system became pointless overnight. So this legendary American icon was basically a startup that got crushed the moment better tech arrived. 13. People scream about the Confederate flag, completely unaware they are arguing about the wrong flag. The design everyone fights over was never the official national flag of the Confederacy. It was just a battle flag carried by one army group. Historians sigh. Internet warriors keep posting it anyway. The actual Confederate national flags looked totally different and are mostly forgotten today. So the most controversial symbol in American history is technically a military banner that got promoted to fame entirely by accident. 14. The story goes that settlers bought all of Manhattan for $24 in shiny beads, which is adorable and also nonsense. That dollar figure was a wild guess scribbled down in the 1800s. The Lenape people who lived there did not even believe land could be owned. They likely thought they were agreeing to share it. Settlers assumed otherwise. So the greatest real estate deal in history was really two groups completely misunderstanding each other, with one side accidentally claiming an island. 15. The Statue of Liberty is famously green, but she spent her early years looking like a giant shiny penny. When France first delivered her, she was gleaming copper brown, bright and metallic. New Yorkers admired her. Tourists gawked. Then nature got to work, and over roughly 30 years the copper oxidized into that famous green coating. Some officials actually wanted to repaint her to stop it. So the most iconic green statue on Earth was originally the color of a brand new coin. 16. Charles Lindbergh gets crowned as the first man to fly across the Atlantic, and that crown is slightly too big for his head. Dozens of people had already crossed that ocean by air before him. Pilots had done it in stages. Crews had done it together. Lindbergh's actual achievement was being the first to fly it solo and non-stop, which is genuinely impressive. So he earned his fame, just not the version most Americans remember. He was first at a very specific thing. 17. The fortune cookie feels deeply Chinese, yet it has almost nothing to do with China. The little cracker with the tiny prophecy was popularized in California, most likely by Japanese-American bakers experimenting with sweet treats. Diners loved them. Restaurants ran with it. The cookies eventually got tied to Chinese food in America purely by association. Visit China. And people will stare at you in confusion if you ask for one. So this beloved Chinese tradition was basically invented in the United States. 18. Bonnie and Clyde live in legend as glamorous bank-robbing icons. gliding from one giant heist to the next. The truth is far less cinematic. Most of their robberies hit tiny gas stations and small stores for pocket change. They were broke a lot. They slept in cars. Hollywood later dressed them up in style and gave them dramatic shootouts to sell tickets. So the most famous criminal couple in America were essentially small-time crooks who got a major glow-up from the movies. 19. For 40 years, the United States government ran a study that watched black men slowly die on purpose. In the Tuskegee experiment, doctors told these men they were getting treated for their illness. They were not. Officials had a cure available. They withheld it. The men suffered while researchers calmly took notes, studying syphilis as it destroyed their bodies. Families were never warned. It only ended when a whistleblower exposed it. So America ran one of its cruelest medical betrayals in plain sight. 20. The story of young George Washington chopping a cherry tree and bravely confessing is pure fiction. A biographer named Parson Weems made the whole thing up. He wanted his book to sell, so he invented a wholesome tale about honesty. Readers ate it up. Schools repeated it. Generations of children grew up believing a totally fabricated story about a kid and an axe. So the most famous lesson about telling the truth in American history was built entirely on a lie. 21. Grover Cleveland holds a record so weird it sounds like a math error. He is both the 22nd and the 24th president, somehow counted twice. The trick is that he won, lost, then won again. Voters dumped him after one term. Then they missed him. So 4 years later, they brought him right back, making him the only president to serve 2 terms with another man's term stuffed in the middle. So America technically elected the same guy twice with a gap, and the history books just shrugged and numbered him twice. 22. Billy the Kid supposedly killed 21 men, one for every year of his short life, which is a perfect legend and almost entirely made up. The real number was far smaller, probably around 4 to 9. Storytellers loved the symmetry. Newspapers ran with it. The poetic idea of a man with 1 kill per birthday was just too good to fact-check. So the deadliest outlaw of the frontier was mostly a marketing creation, a scrawny young man whose body count got inflated by people who loved a tidy story. 23. Plenty of Americans think slavery was strictly a Southern problem, but the North was knee-deep in it too. Northern states owned enslaved people for generations. New York in particular dragged its feet for an embarrassingly long time. Lawmakers stalled. Owners resisted. The state did not fully abolish slavery until 1827, long after the nation loved to picture itself as the land of the free. So the moral high ground the North enjoys in textbooks was built on a foundation it conveniently forgot to mention. 24. Movies show Plains tribes thundering across the prairie on horseback, like they always had horses, but they did not. There were no horses in the Americas at all before Europeans arrived. Tribes had to hunt and travel on foot for centuries. Then Spanish colonizers brought horses over. Native peoples adopted them brilliantly and fast. Within a few generations, they became some of the finest riders on the planet. So the iconic image of the mounted warrior was actually a stunning upgrade powered by accidental imports. 25. Many people assume the founders stamped "In God We Trust" onto everything from day one, but it showed up surprisingly late. The phrase only became the official national motto in 1956, deep into the Cold War. Politicians wanted to look distinct from godless communism. Congress agreed enthusiastically. The original founders never made it the nation's motto at all, so a phrase Americans treat as ancient and foundational is actually younger than rock and roll, slapped on during a panicky standoff with the Soviet Union. 26. Everybody pictures Prohibition as the era when drinking was illegal, but technically, you could sip all you wanted. The law only banned making, selling, and transporting alcohol. Owning and drinking it was perfectly fine, so wealthy people stockpiled massive private collections before the ban hit. They sipped legally, their neighbors raided speakeasies. Meanwhile, the average person got hauled off for buying a beer. So, Prohibition basically punished people for getting alcohol while letting the rich enjoy their preloaded liquor cabinets in total comfort. 27. Milton Hershey did not just sell chocolate. He built an entire town obsessed with it. He created Hershey, Pennsylvania, a full community for his factory workers. There were homes, schools, and parks. Workers settled in happily. Visitors marveled. The man even installed streetlights shaped like giant Hershey kisses, because subtlety was clearly not his thing. So while other industrialists were busy being ruthless, this candy tycoon built a wholesome chocolate kingdom where the lampposts themselves reminded you to buy more of his product. 28. Jesse James gets remembered as a Robin Hood figure who robbed the rich for the poor, which is a beautiful lie. He kept every dollar. The man started out as a brutal pro-Confederate guerrilla during the Civil War, then transitioned into robbing trains and banks for himself. Folks romanticized him. Newspapers helped. The poor never saw a cent of his loot. So the legendary outlaw with a heart of gold was really just a violent thief with excellent public relations and a very generous fan base. 29. In 1921, a thriving black neighborhood in Tulsa was burned to the ground, and America spent decades pretending it never happened. The district was so prosperous people called it Black Wall Street. A white mob descended. Homes and businesses were destroyed. Hundreds likely died, and survivors lost everything they had built. Then the whole event was scrubbed from textbooks for generations. So one of the worst acts of racial violence in American history was nearly erased entirely, quietly buried until decades later. 30. Patrick Henry's famous cry of, "Give me liberty or give me death," is one of the most quoted lines in American history, and nobody actually wrote it down. He supposedly thundered it during a speech. The crowd was moved, the room buzzed, but there was no transcript, no recording, nothing. Decades after Henry died, a biographer reconstructed the speech from people's foggy memories. So the most patriotic battle cry in the nation may have been polished, paraphrased, or partly invented long after the man was gone. 31. The teddy bear exists because a president refused to be a jerk to a tied-up animal. While hunting, Theodore Roosevelt was offered an easy shot at a bear that had been captured and tied to a tree. He said no, it felt unsporting. A cartoonist drew the moment, the public melted, and a toy maker started selling stuffed bears named after Teddy. So one of the cuddliest toys on earth was born from a president having basic decency on a bad hunting trip. 32. Bass Reeves was a formerly enslaved man who became one of the most fearless lawmen the frontier ever saw. After gaining his freedom, he became a U.S. Marshal and was astonishingly good at it. Outlaws feared him, criminals fled from him. Over his career, he arrested roughly 3,000 of them, often using clever disguises to catch his targets off guard. Yet his name vanished from most textbooks. So one of America's greatest real-life heroes spent decades being forgotten for no good reason. 33. Juneteenth marks the day enslaved people in Texas finally learned they were free. And the delay is infuriating. The Emancipation Proclamation had already declared them free 2.5 years earlier. Word just never reached them. Owners stayed silent, troops were absent. It took Union soldiers riding into Galveston in 1865 to deliver the news that should have arrived ages ago. So thousands of people kept laboring in bondage long after freedom was technically theirs, simply because nobody bothered to tell them. 34. While many assumed native peoples had no written language, one Cherokee man personally invented an entire alphabet. His name was Sequoyah, and he built a full writing system from scratch. People doubted him. Skeptics mocked him. Then his system worked so well that the Cherokee Nation achieved widespread literacy and even printed their own newspaper. So a single determined man gave his entire people the power of the written word, accomplishing alone what usually takes whole civilizations centuries to develop. 35. The Star-Spangled Banner sounds proudly American, but its tune was lifted straight from an old British drinking club. The melody came from a song sung by a gentleman's social society back in England. Francis Scott Key wrote new patriotic lyrics over it. Americans loved it. Congress dragged its feet, though, and it did not officially become the national anthem until 1931. So the song Americans belt out at every ballgame is patriotic poetry stapled onto a centuries-old British party tune. 36. Pearl Harbor is remembered as a total shock, but the warning signs were literally on a screen. Radar operators that morning spotted a huge cluster of incoming planes approaching the islands. They reported it. Superiors waved it off, assuming the blips were friendly American aircraft. Nobody panicked. Nobody prepared. Minutes later, the bombs began falling on the unsuspecting fleet. So one of the most devastating surprise attacks in history was actually detected in advance and then casually ignored by the people in charge. 37. Ranch dressing, the most American condiment imaginable, was invented by a plumber freezing in Alaska. While working remote jobs, Steve Henson tinkered with a creamy buttermilk recipe to make bland food taste better. Workers loved it. Word spread. He later bought a dude ranch in California, served the dressing to guests, and demand exploded. So the beloved dip Americans pour on pizza, wings, and basically everything was created by a pipe fitter trying to survive bland meals in the frozen wilderness. 38. Lizzie Borden is forever the woman who axed her parents, except a court actually found her not guilty. The famous nursery rhyme convicted her in the public imagination. The jury did not. Evidence was shaky. Doubts were real. The catchy little chant about 40 whacks spread faster than any verdict ever could, branding her a murderer for eternity. So one of America's most notorious killers was legally innocent, condemned forever by a creepy schoolyard rhyme, rather than by any actual courtroom. 39. Hawaii became part of America through a move that looks a lot like a hostile takeover. In 1893, the islands were an independent kingdom with their own queen. American business interests wanted control. They organized, they schemed. With backing from U.S. forces, they overthrew the monarchy and pushed aside Queen Liliuokalani so the islands could eventually be annexed. So the dreamy vacation paradise of postcards joined the United States after powerful outsiders toppled a sovereign nation that never asked to be taken. 40. The phrase separation of church and state feels like it must be carved into the Constitution, yet it appears nowhere in it. The words simply are not there. Thomas Jefferson wrote them in a private letter to a church group, describing his personal view. People later treated that line as official law. Courts cited it. So a casual phrase from one man's correspondence became one of the most quoted constitutional principles in America, despite never actually being in the Constitution at all. 41. Calvin Coolidge got sworn in as president in the most low-key way imaginable. He was visiting his family farm when news arrived that the sitting president had died. There was no fancy ceremony, no marble hall. His own father, a humble notary public, administered the oath by the glow of a kerosene lamp in the middle of the night. Then Coolidge reportedly went back to bed. So one of the most powerful jobs on earth was handed over by lamplight on a quiet country farm. 42. The gold rush made fortunes, just not for the people frantically digging for gold. Most miners arrived broke, struggled in the dirt, and left even broker. The real winners were the merchants. Shovel sellers got rich, tent makers thrived. One clever fellow named Levi Strauss started selling sturdy denim pants to miners and built an empire. So while desperate prospectors chased shiny dreams in the mud, the smartest people in California simply sold them the tools and walked away wealthy. 43. Americans love debating their many wars, but one of them quietly outkilled all the others combined. The Civil War was staggeringly deadly. Brothers fought brothers. Disease spread through camps. By the end, more Americans had died in that single conflict than in every other U.S. war added together. Bullets, infection, and starvation took an unimaginable toll. So the bloodiest enemy America ever faced was not some foreign power across the ocean. It was itself, tearing apart its own people on home soil. 44. In the 1800s, the U.S. Army helped wipe out tens of millions of bison, and the cruelty was strategic. Officials realized that Plains nations depended on the herds for food, clothing, and survival. So destroying the bison meant destroying the people. Hunters slaughtered relentlessly. Soldiers encouraged it. The animals were left rotting by the thousands across the prairie. So one of the largest mass killings of animals in history was partly a deliberate plan to starve native communities into surrender. 45. Conspiracy fans insist the eye and pyramid on the dollar bill is secret Illuminati branding, but the truth is far more boring. The design was created back in 1782 for the nation's Great Seal. The unfinished pyramid simply represented a young country still being built. The eye symbolized watchful providence. There was no shadowy cabal, just some founders picking symbols. So the spooky Illuminati evidence people point to on their cash is really just patriotic clip art. From the 18th century, 46. The Spanish flu got its name through a global misunderstanding, and Spain got robbed. The deadly 1918 pandemic did not actually start there. During World War I, most countries censored news of the outbreak to keep wartime morale high. Spain was neutral. Spain reported honestly. Because Spanish newspapers openly covered the disease, the rest of the world assumed it began there and slapped the country's name on it. So an entire nation got blamed for a plague simply for telling the truth. 47. Buffalo wings contain exactly 0 buffalo, which disappoints absolutely no one once they taste them. The name comes from the city, not the animal. They were invented in Buffalo, New York, back in 1964, reportedly whipped up late one night at a bar using leftover chicken parts nobody wanted. Customers devoured them. Word spread fast. The spicy snack soon conquered sports bars across the country. So the All-American wing got its name from a city, and the buffalo had nothing to do with it. 48. H.H. Holmes is sold as America's first serial killer with a terrifying murder castle full of trapdoors and gas chambers. Much of that was newspaper fantasy. Reporters of the era loved a gruesome story and cranked the details up wildly. Some crimes were real. Many were exaggerated. The legendary building of horrors was nowhere near as elaborate as the headlines screamed. So one of the creepiest tales in American history was partly a real killer and partly a tabloid sales strategy built on hype. 49. For generations, Native American children were ripped from their families and shipped to boarding schools built to erase them. These schools had a chilling goal. Officials wanted to strip away every trace of Native identity. Children were forbidden from speaking their languages. Their traditions were banned. Their hair was cut and their names were changed in an effort to force assimilation. So under the polite label of education, the government ran a system designed to quietly wipe out entire cultures, one child at a time. 50. Many Americans assume the founders built a pure democracy, but those men actually feared that idea. They worried that unchecked mob rule could spiral into chaos, so they deliberately designed a republic instead. Power got divided. Representatives got elected. Layers of checks were stacked everywhere to slow down hasty decisions. The founders openly distrusted the idea of the majority always getting its way instantly. So the country waving the democracy banner was intentionally engineered to be something a bit more cautious and controlled. 51. James Madison helped build the entire nation, and he did it while being absolutely tiny. The man stood barely 5'4" and weighed around 100 pounds soaking wet. He was the smallest president in history. Critics underestimated him constantly. Opponents towered over him. Yet this pint-sized thinker basically fathered the Constitution and outmaneuvered far bigger men in every debate. So the guy who designed the framework of American government could have been mistaken for a middle schooler at a very formal party. 52. Johnny Appleseed is remembered as a gentle soul, planting sweet apples for hungry families, but his apples were nasty. They were small, sour, and basically inedible straight off the tree. Nobody wanted to bite one, so why grow them? Because those bitter apples were perfect for making hard cider, the alcoholic drink frontier settlers adored. So the wholesome legend who supposedly spread healthy fruit across America was actually helping the whole frontier get pleasantly buzzed, one orchard of booze apples at a time. 53. West Virginia exists purely because part of Virginia refused to go along with the rebellion. When Virginia seceded to join the Confederacy during the Civil War, the mountainous western counties wanted no part of it. They preferred the Union. They argued. They split. So they broke away and formed their own brand new state to stay loyal to the United States. So an entire state on the modern map was born out of a stubborn regional argument about whose side to fight on. 54. Long before America existed, Native people pulled off a revolt so successful it kicked an empire out for over a decade. In 1680, the Pueblo people of New Mexico rose up against their Spanish colonizers. They were tired of the brutality. They coordinated brilliantly. The uprising drove the Spanish completely out of the region for more than 12 years. So, one of the most effective anti-colonial revolts on the continent happened generations before the famous American Revolution, and almost nobody talks about it. 55. The iconic Hollywood sign started life as a tacky billboard for selling houses. Originally, it did not say Hollywood at all. It read Hollywoodland, advertising a fancy new housing development in the hills. Developers wanted buyers. The giant letters were just marketing. The land part eventually fell into disrepair and got removed, leaving behind the world-famous word we know today. So the glamorous symbol of movie star dreams was really a real estate ad that accidentally became the most recognizable sign on the planet. 56. The legend says a radio broadcast of War of the Worlds sent millions of Americans into screaming panic over an alien invasion. That mass hysteria mostly never happened. Very few people actually freaked out. Newspapers, however, hated radio for stealing their advertisers, so they wildly exaggerated the chaos to make the new medium look dangerous. Readers believed it. The myth stuck. So the most famous media panic in history was largely invented by jealous newspapers trying to sabotage their broadcasting rivals. 57. Ketchup is the king of American condiments, but its original version would horrify any modern burger fan. The earliest ketchup contained no tomatoes whatsoever. Instead, it was a funky fermented fish sauce, salty and pungent and slightly alarming. People poured it on everything. Tomatoes only got added much later, transforming it into the sweet red goop everyone knows. So the stuff Americans squirt onto fries by the gallon began as essentially rotted fish juice, which is a glow-up nobody saw coming. 58. The Hatfields and McCoys waged one of the most famous feuds in American history, and part of it kicked off over a pig. A dispute about who owned the animal helped ignite years of bitter conflict between the two families. Tempers flared. Grudges festered. But the feud was not all dramatic mountain shootouts, since a good chunk of the fighting actually played out in courtrooms with lawsuits and legal battles. So America's deadliest family rivalry partly began with livestock and was partly settled with paperwork. 59. During World War II, the United States locked up around 120,000 Japanese Americans for the crime of existing. Most of them were actual U.S. citizens. They had committed no offense: fear and racism. After Pearl Harbor drove the government to round them up, families lost homes, people lost businesses. They were shoved into bleak internment camps surrounded by barbed wire, simply for their heritage. So while America fought tyranny abroad, it was busy imprisoning its own innocent citizens at home. 60. Everyone learns that Ben Franklin flew a kite in a thunderstorm and casually discovered electricity, but the real version would have fried him. If he had actually let lightning strike his kite directly, the surge would have killed him on the spot. The popular cartoon image is wildly misleading. He more likely drew faint electrical charge from stormy air, far more carefully. Survival required caution, so the beloved tale of a grinning Franklin getting zapped is basically a recipe for accidental electrocution. 61. The myth says Lincoln scribbled the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope during a quick train ride. The reality is far less dramatic. Lincoln actually worked on the speech carefully and deliberately ahead of time. He drafted it, he revised it. The idea of him casually doodling one of history's greatest speeches between train stops is a charming fantasy that makes him sound effortlessly brilliant. So the truth is that he was a careful craftsman, not a genius improvising on a napkin. 62. At one point, the U.S. Army decided the best way to cross the desert was with camels. Yes, actual camels. The military imported a herd of them to haul supplies across the brutal southwestern terrain, forming the short-lived U.S. Camel Corps. The animals actually performed pretty well. Soldiers were baffled. Horses were jealous. But the Civil War interrupted the experiment, and the whole camel plan quietly fell apart. So America genuinely had a desert camel squad before deciding it was too weird to continue. 63. The first battle between two ironclad warships instantly turned every wooden navy on Earth into floating junk. When the Monitor and the Virginia clashed during the Civil War, their iron hulls shrugged off cannon fire. Wooden ships could not compete. Admirals panicked. Navies everywhere suddenly realized their entire fleets were obsolete overnight. So a single duel between two metal-plated oddball ships in American waters rewrote naval warfare for the whole world. forcing every major power to scramble and rebuild from scratch. 64. Long before the United States wrote its constitution, the Iroquois Confederacy was already running a sophisticated, multi-nation government. 6 separate nations united under one organized system. They shared power, they made decisions together. This complex political structure operated successfully for centuries, with rules and councils that handled disputes across the whole alliance. So while Europe often imagined native peoples as disorganized, an advanced and durable democracy was thriving in North America long before the founders ever started arguing over how to govern themselves. 65. Uncle Sam was not just a symbol, he was an actual guy with a meatpacking business. His name was Samuel Wilson, and during the War of 1812, he supplied beef to American troops. He stamped his barrels with the letters U.S. Soldiers joked the meat came from Uncle Sam. The nickname spread. Eventually, it became the personification of the entire country, complete with the famous top hat. So, the iconic finger-pointing patriotic figure started as a butcher, labeling barrels of army beef. 66. People love claiming daylight saving time was created to help farmers, and farmers would like a word. They actually hated it. The time change messed with their schedules, their livestock, and their harvesting routines. So they fought against it, not for it. The real push came from other interests entirely, including those who wanted more evening daylight for leisure and shopping. So the most repeated excuse for springing the clocks forward is completely backwards, since the very people it supposedly helped were among its loudest opponents. 67. Cinco de Mayo is not Mexican Independence Day, no matter how many American bars insist otherwise. It actually marks a single military victory when Mexican forces beat a much larger French army in one specific battle. That is it. Mexico barely makes a huge deal of it. Yet somehow the holiday became a massive celebration in the United States, complete with sales and parties. So the day Americans treat as Mexico's big birthday is really a minor battle anniversary that blew up north of the border. 68. Before Watergate ever happened, America already had a monster corruption scandal involving oil and bribes. It was called the Teapot Dome scandal. Government officials secretly leased valuable oil reserves to private companies in exchange for fat bribes. Money changed hands, secrets leaked. When it all unraveled, it became the biggest government corruption case in the nation up to that point. So decades before tape recorders and burglars took down a president, greasy oil deals were already proving how messy Washington could get. 69. In 1882, the United States passed a law that flat-out banned an entire nationality from immigrating. The Chinese Exclusion Act specifically targeted Chinese people, slamming the door shut for decades. Workers were turned away, families were separated. It was the first major American law to ban immigration based purely on nationality, born from economic fear and ugly prejudice. So the country that loved branding itself as a welcoming land of opportunity wrote outright ethnic exclusion directly into its laws for an embarrassingly long time. 70. The phrase "Founding Fathers" conjures images of wise old men with gray beards and powdered wigs, but many of them were practically kids. Several key figures were in their 20s during the Revolution. They were ambitious, they were reckless. They were young hotheads gambling everything on a risky rebellion against the most powerful empire on earth. So the dignified elder statesmen frozen in oil paintings were often energetic young rebels who would probably be considered too inexperienced to run for office today. 71. Andrew Jackson pulled off something no other president ever managed. He paid off the entire national debt down to zero. The whole thing, gone. He hated debt with a burning passion and made wiping it out his personal mission. He slashed spending. He sold off land. For one brief shining moment, the United States owed absolutely nothing to anyone. Then, the economy promptly tanked anyway. So the only man to ever zero out America's debt is also remembered for the financial mess that followed right after. 72. Davy Crockett. The rugged coonskin cap frontier legend was mostly built by a 1950s television show. Disney cranked out a wildly popular series about him, and the country went bananas. Kids demanded coonskin caps. Stores sold out. The real Crockett was a genuine frontiersman and politician, but the larger-than-life mythical hero image was a marketing machine. So the towering wilderness icon burned into American memory was less about the actual man and more about a clever Disney production turning him into a merchandising goldmine. 73. Robert E. Lee gets painted as a reluctant gentleman who secretly hated slavery, but the records tell a harsher story. He inherited enslaved people and dragged his feet on freeing them. He treated them harshly. He even pursued those who tried to escape. The noble conflicted hero image is mostly polished myth crafted long after the war. So, one of the most romanticized figures of the Confederacy was far less sympathetic up close than the gentle, honor-bound legend that later generations decided to remember. 74. Roughly half of all 50 U.S. state names come straight from Native American words, and most Americans never realize it. Connecticut, Massachusetts, Ohio, Utah, and dozens more all trace back to indigenous languages. The words describe rivers, lands, and peoples. Settlers borrowed them constantly, so while the country spent centuries pushing native nations off their land, it simultaneously stamped native words across the entire map. So half the states people proudly call home are literally named in the languages of the people who were displaced. 75. Mount Rushmore was never actually finished, and it sits on stolen sacred ground. The original design was supposed to show the presidents down to their waists, but funding ran out and work stopped. So they are forever stuck at the head. Worse, the mountain itself sits on land sacred to the Lakota people, taken after treaties were broken. So the giant patriotic monument millions visit each year is technically an unfinished carving planted on land that was promised to others and then seized. 76. That famous VJ Day photo of a sailor kissing a woman in Times Square looks like pure romance, but it was nothing of the sort. The two were complete strangers. In the chaos of celebrating the war's end, the sailor grabbed a random nurse he had never met and kissed her. She did not see it coming. The crowd cheered. The image became iconic. So one of the most beloved romantic photographs in American history was actually a total stranger getting unexpectedly grabbed in public. 77. Baseball loves the story that Abner Doubleday invented it on an American field, making it purely homegrown. That origin tale was basically fabricated. A committee in the early 1900s wanted the sport to have patriotic American roots, so they credited Doubleday with little real evidence. He probably never even played. The game actually evolved from older British bat and ball games, so America's pastime was given a made-up birth story by people who simply wanted it to feel proudly and exclusively American. 78. In 1962, 3 prisoners pulled off an escape from Alcatraz, so clean they were never seen again. They carved through the walls using spoons and improvised tools, left dummy heads in their beds, and slipped into the freezing bay on a homemade raft. Guards had no clue until morning. Authorities searched everywhere. The men simply vanished into the night and were never found. So one of the most escape-proof prisons in America was outsmarted by 3 guys, some spoons, and a lot of nerve. 79. Native Americans were not granted full U.S. citizenship until 1924, which is absurd considering whose land it was. They had lived on the continent for thousands of years. They were here first, yet they had to wait until the 20th century to officially be recognized as citizens of the country built on top of their homelands. The law finally passed long after waves of immigrants had already been naturalized. So the original inhabitants became legal citizens of their own land embarrassingly late in the game. 80. The Constitution was written in total secrecy, with the windows nailed shut during a brutal Philadelphia summer. The delegates wanted absolutely no leaks, so they sealed the room, banned outside chatter, and sweated through the suffocating heat for months. They roasted, they argued, they debated the future of an entire nation while basically trapped in a stuffy oven by choice. So the founding document Americans revere was hammered out by a bunch of overheated men who literally chose misery to keep their plans hidden. 81. Franklin Roosevelt led the nation through a depression and a world war, all while hiding that he used a wheelchair. A bout of illness had left him unable to walk easily. He refused to let the public see it. So he went to extreme lengths, gripping podiums, leaning on aids, and arranging photos carefully to appear standing. Reporters cooperated. Cameras stayed away. For years, most Americans had no idea their powerful president could barely walk. So one of history's greatest leaders pulled off a remarkable cover-up. 82. Sacagawea is celebrated as the woman who guided Lewis and Clark across the wilderness, but that is not quite her real role. She was not their map-reading navigator. She was mainly an interpreter. More importantly, her presence as a young woman traveling with a baby signaled to other tribes that the expedition came in peace, not for war. That alone protected the whole group. So her greatest contribution was not pointing the way, but quietly keeping a band of nervous strangers alive through pure diplomacy. 83. Harriet Tubman did far more than lead people north on the Underground Railroad. She actually led an armed military raid during the Civil War. Working with Union forces, she helped guide a daring riverboat mission deep into enemy territory. Plans were set. Boats moved in. In a single night, the operation freed over 700 enslaved people, making her the first woman to lead such an assault in the war. So the gentle figure from textbooks was also a fearless armed commander. 84. Lacrosse is often treated as a preppy modern sport, but it is an ancient Native American game with serious stakes. Originally, it was played by hundreds of men at once, spread across miles of open land. Games were massive. Games were brutal. Tribes sometimes used the contest to settle disputes between communities, treating it almost like organized warfare with rules. So the sport, now associated with tidy fields and matching uniforms, began as a sprawling, intense tradition that could decide real conflicts between entire nations. 85. The current 50-star American flag was designed by a teenager for a school project, and his teacher was not impressed. A 17-year-old named Robert Heft sewed the design when Alaska and Hawaii were about to join the Union. He turned it in. His teacher gave him a B-. Then his flag got submitted to the government and actually got chosen as the official national flag. The teacher reportedly bumped his grade up afterward. So the flag every American salutes started as mediocre homework. 86. Before World War II, the United States turned away a ship full of desperate Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazis. The vessel was the MS St. Louis, carrying over 900 people seeking safety. They begged to be let in. America refused. The ship was forced to sail back toward Europe, where many of those passengers would later die in the Holocaust. So while the nation likes to remember itself as the hero of the war, it once slammed its doors on people running for their lives. 87. The Frisbee got its name from a pie company, which is delightfully random. Back in the day, the Frisbee Pie Company sold its pies in round metal tins. College students discovered that the empty tins flew beautifully when tossed around campus. They threw them constantly. The fun caught on. A toy company later turned the idea into a plastic flying disc and borrowed the name. So, the beloved backyard toy is basically named after leftover pie containers that bored students chucked at each other for fun. 88. J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI like his own personal spy empire and quietly collected dirt on everyone. For decades, he secretly kept files on politicians, celebrities, activists, and anyone he considered a threat. He hoarded secrets. He gathered scandals. This stash of private information made him terrifyingly powerful, since the people who could fire him feared what he might reveal. So one unelected official basically blackmail-proofed himself by knowing everybody's worst secrets, ruling Washington from the shadows far longer than anyone should have allowed. 89. Freed slaves were once promised 40 acres and a mule to start their new lives, and then it was snatched right back. After the Civil War, an order set aside land for newly freed families. Hopes soared. Plans began. But within months, the government reversed course, returned the land to former Confederate owners, and crushed those promises. So, one of the most famous pledges of fairness in American history lasted barely a season before being yanked away, leaving freed families with nothing once again. 90. Americans imagined the Revolution as a united uprising where everyone hated the British, but the country was deeply split. By one famous estimate, only about a third of colonists actually backed the rebellion. Another third stayed loyal to Britain. The rest just wanted to be left out of the whole mess entirely. Neighbors disagreed bitterly. families fractured. So the glorious patriotic struggle was really a divided, messy affair where a huge chunk of the population either opposed independence or wished the fighting would simply stop. 91. Gerald Ford holds a record so strange it almost sounds impossible. He became both vice president and president without ever being elected to either job. When the sitting vice president resigned, Ford got appointed to fill the spot. Then the president resigned too. Suddenly, Ford was running the entire country. Nobody had voted him into either role. So the most powerful person in America at that moment had reached the top through a chain of resignations rather than a single ballot ever being cast for him. 92. The Alamo legend insists every defender died bravely to the last man, but that is simply not true. There were actually survivors. Women, children, and several enslaved people lived through the battle and walked out afterward. They told their stories. The myth that absolutely everyone perished makes for a dramatic tale, but it erases the real people who survived to describe what happened. So one of the most famous last stands in American history quietly leaves out the fact that not everybody inside actually died. 93. The first major battle of the Civil War drew crowds who showed up to watch it like entertainment. Believing the fight at Bull Run would be a quick, thrilling spectacle, fancy spectators rode out from Washington with picnic baskets. They spread blankets. They settled in. Then the battle turned brutal and chaotic, sending both soldiers and horrified picnickers fleeing in panic. So civilians literally packed snacks to enjoy a war as a fun day out, only to discover that actual combat is genuinely terrifying. 94. The Trail of Tears is often remembered as only the Cherokee tragedy, but it was far larger than that. Multiple nations were forced off their homelands. The Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, and others were also driven west under brutal conditions. Thousands died. Families were shattered. The forced removals stretched across many tribes, not just one, making it a sweeping campaign of displacement. So the grim chapter most people associate with a single nation actually swept up numerous native peoples in the same heartbreaking forced march. 95. Plymouth Rock is treated as the sacred spot where the Pilgrims first stepped ashore, except there is zero proof of that. No record from the time mentions any famous rock at all. The whole story only surfaced more than 120 years later, when an elderly man suddenly claimed to know the exact landing spot. People believed him. Tourists flocked. So the legendary boulder millions visit is basically a random rock that got promoted to national treasure on the strength of one late memory. 96. The word okay started as a dumb newspaper joke, which is honestly the most American origin imaginable. Back in 1839, writers thought it was hilarious to misspell phrases on purpose. They wrote all correct instead of all correct, then shortened it to okay. The gag spread. The joke stuck. Soon, the silly abbreviation escaped the newspaper and conquered the entire English language. So one of the most used words on Earth began as a goofy spelling prank that somehow refused to die and went global. 97. Jaywalking was not even a real crime until the auto industry basically invented it to dodge blame. In the early days of cars, pedestrians constantly got hit, and the public blamed the drivers. Car makers panicked. Sales were at risk. So they pushed the idea that streets belonged to cars and coined the insulting term jaywalker to shame people for crossing freely. So the crime of simply walking across a road was manufactured by an industry desperate to make the victims look like the problem. 98. Wild Bill Hickok supposedly died holding aces and eights, forever known as the dead man's hand. But the legend is shakier than the story suggests. He was indeed shot dead during a poker game. The famous card combination, however, is mostly unverified folklore added later. Nobody truly confirmed his exact hand. Storytellers loved the dramatic detail. So the iconic dead man's hand that still spooks poker players today is far more myth than documented fact, dressed up over the years into a perfect legend. 99. It is wild to think that American women could not reliably get a credit card in their own name until 1974. Before then, banks routinely demanded that a husband co-sign. A single woman often got flatly refused. A married woman got treated like a financial child. It took a federal law to finally ban that discrimination and let women access credit independently. So, within living memory, Half the country was essentially blocked from basic financial freedom simply for not being a man. 100. The phrase "founding fathers" feels ancient, like the men coined it about themselves, but it is surprisingly modern. The term was not even invented until 1916. The man who came up with it was Warren G. Harding, long before he became president. He used it in a speech. The label caught on. So the grand, almost biblical title we slap on the nation's earliest leaders was actually cooked up over a century after the founding by a future president with a flair for catchy phrases. 101. For decades, people joked that JFK accidentally called himself a jelly donut in Berlin. And that joke is flat out wrong. When Kennedy declared "Ich bin ein Berliner," his German was perfectly correct. The crowd understood him completely. They cheered. There happened to be a pastry called a Berliner in some regions, which spawned the myth, but locals knew exactly what he meant. So one of the most famous language blunders in history never actually happened, and the man nailed his big emotional moment just fine. 102. The classic cowboy hat that screams Wild West did not even show up until the 1860s. Before that, frontier cowboys wore all sorts of random headgear. Some sported bowler hats. Others wore sombreros or whatever they could grab. The tall, wide-brimmed hat everyone pictures was a later invention that got marketed hard and eventually became standard. So the single most iconic cowboy accessory in American culture was actually a relatively late arrival. And the earliest cowboys looked far less stylish than the movies suggest. 103. The Underground Railroad confuses a lot of people because it was neither underground nor an actual railroad. There were no secret tunnels. There were no trains. Instead, it was a brave network of people running safe houses and secret routes to help enslaved people escape to freedom. Guides risked everything. Hosts hid strangers. They borrowed railroad words like stations and conductors as code. So, the legendary escape system many imagine as literal hidden tracks was really a courageous web of ordinary humans quietly defying the law. 104. The Lewis and Clark expedition leaned heavily on a man named York, and history barely thanked him. York was enslaved by Clark and worked as a full member of the crew. He hunted, he scouted, he helped the group survive and even amazed many native communities they met. Yet despite contributing as much as anyone on the journey, he was denied his freedom for years afterward. So one of the expedition's most valuable members got treated as property long after helping make it succeed. 105. The Liberty Bell is famous for cracking while ringing for independence, except that dramatic story never happened. It did not crack during any patriotic celebration. The famous crack actually appeared much later, well after the Revolution, from ordinary wear. Even the name came later. Abolitionists fighting slavery adopted the bell as their symbol and gave it the Liberty name. So the beloved icon tied to America's birth got both its crack and its famous title long after the moment everyone imagines it ringing. 106. The We Can Do It. Do It poster of Rosie the Riveter feels like a wartime sensation, but during World War II almost nobody saw it. The image was barely used at the time. It hung briefly in a few factories and then basically disappeared. Decades passed. Then, in the 1980s, it got rediscovered and exploded into a feminist icon plastered on everything. So the poster everyone assumes rallied millions of women during the war was actually an obscure flop that only became famous generations later. 107. Black Friday did not originally mean stores finally turning a profit, despite the popular explanation. That cheerful Into the Black story came much later. The term was actually coined by frustrated police officers in Philadelphia to describe the chaos after Thanksgiving. Crowds flooded the streets. Traffic snarled everywhere. Cops dreaded the exhausting day of managing shoppers and tourists pouring into the city. So the shopping holiday everyone treats as a celebration of bargains was named by miserable police who absolutely hated the swarming madness it created. 108. The Pinkertons sound like a quaint old detective agency, but they were essentially a private army for hire. Corporations paid them to crush labor strikes, often violently. When workers organized for better conditions, companies called in these hired guns. Heads got cracked. Strikes got broken. They functioned like a muscle squad protecting business interests against ordinary laborers fighting for fair treatment. So the famous detective outfit from history was really a corporate enforcement force used to beat down workers who simply wanted safer jobs and decent pay. 109. It is jarring to realize the U.S. military stayed racially segregated all the way until 1948. Black soldiers fought and died for their country, yet they served in separate units and faced constant discrimination. They bled the same. They were treated as lesser. It took a presidential order from Harry Truman to finally desegregate the armed forces. So the same military that battled tyranny and racism overseas spent years enforcing strict racial separation within its own ranks before finally being forced to integrate. 110. A popular myth claims America almost made German its official language, losing to English by a single vote. It never happened. There was never any such vote in Congress to choose a national language. The story likely grew from a minor proposal about printing some laws in German for immigrants. People exaggerated it. The tale spread anyway. So one of the most repeated language legends in the country is complete fiction, since America has never even had an official language to vote on in the first place. 111. This one breaks people's brains. President John Tyler was born in 1790, yet one of his grandsons was still alive within just the last few years. The secret is that both Tyler and his son fathered children very late in life. Generations got stretched enormously. So a man born when George Washington was president had a living grandson well into modern times, casually overlapping with smartphones and the internet. So the family tree of an early American president somehow reached almost into the present day. And that is just the beginning, because history is way dumber, wilder, and crazier than school ever told you. Your teachers gave you the boring version. We give you the truth. So, if even one of these facts cracked your brain wide open, smash that like button right now. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next batch of insane history they hid from you. And drop a comment telling me which fact shocked you the most, because I read every single one. This is Dumb History, where the past is way dumber than you think. See you in the next one.